Great. Well, thanks. It's great to be here. That was a tough act to follow. That was great. Yeah, it's real stuff, which is nice. It's always nice to have real things at conferences, isn't it, rather than esoteric things. I'm going to go a bit esoteric, I'm afraid, but I'll try not to go too far in that direction. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. This is what we get you to do if you interact with us at the journal. If you're an author or a reviewer, you have to declare any conflicts of interest, or as we call them at the BMJ, competing interests. It's slightly less pejorative. So I think those are the ones that are relevant. Well, I don't have any others, but the things you should know about, I guess. So I'll just let you read that. I hope you can read it at the back. There was a neat study done at the oncology conference, ASCO, the American Society for Clinical Oncology, a couple of years ago and just published recently, where the authors of this study looked to see the proportion of presenters at this cancer conference who included a conflict of interest slide. And it was very high because it was mandatory. But then they timed it, and people had them up there for a second or two, so you couldn't actually read any of them. So if you're going to do it, you've got to make sure people can read it. One thing that might be relevant because of the e-learning program that you have here, we've launched 2 years ago this massive e-learning program called Research to Publication, which is from us and UCSF, the University of California, San Francisco. It's a big old thing. It's 200 hours of e-learning on how to plan and conduct clinical research with scientific and ethical integrity, with a particular focus on trials, and then a whole bunch of stuff from us on how to report your research, all kinds of research at all stages, with ethically and so on. And it's on subscription largely for institutions, and we're really pleased it's already in use in more than 10 sub-Saharan African countries, in 3 postgrad institutes in India. It's about to be used in Bangladesh. It's been translated into Chinese and available on a Chinese platform. It's in use in Mexico's biggest university and in some parts of Europe too. So we're really pleased about that. I guess you don't need it because you have your own great course, but it's effectively a conflict of interest for this. Right. I'm going to talk about these things, but I'm building, I hope, on things that you've already heard today, and to some extent giving you a bit of an update. So people have talked about this, but I've kind of captured it in one slide. It's a bit small for those smaller screens, and it's probably a bit small if you're at the back looking at the big screen. You never know how big the screen's going to be. I've given talks in India when it's a telly. I've given talks in China when it's an IMAX and I'm a little dot in front of the screen. You never know. So I try not to do this sort of thing very often, but there's a lot of information to squeeze on. Basically, this is from the 5 articles that you should all read if you haven't read them. They're in the Lancet in 2014. They are free to read on registration. You don't have to pay. They're also all available on a separate website hosted by the bunch of people that kind of co-authored these articles, but also enlisted a wider group of people really concerned about waste in health research, including me, but there are lots of us involved in this. And if you Google research waste and reward, you will find it. If you just do research waste, you get a whole load of stuff about how to handle things like plastic bottles. Anyway, the whole point of this really, and it's pretty shocking, this 85% of research is wasted, costing that much a year, and you think, oh yeah, come on, you're just exaggerating. But in these 5 articles and in subsequent work, these authors have done some pretty nitty-gritty estimations using data. For instance, the amount of money that is wasted in the US and beyond, extramurally, through NIH grants, National Institutes of Health grants, being given to studies that in the end were not completed, not fully reported, or not reported at all. This is not just trials. This is a whole, the whole range of health research, or studies that had to be retracted fully or partially because of fraud or fatal errors and so on. And that amounts to a huge amount of money. And they did lots of different estimates like this and came up with that number. So it's not plucked out of thin air. Anyway, there's 5 points here. And then, the most important really is that you have to start in the right place. We all focus so much on results, so much on, the outputs, but, they're meaningless. They're utterly meaningless if the question wasn't important and clear. and if the question didn't fill a gap in evidence. And then if that question is not answered with the best possible methods, which are reported clearly, then you just don't know whether to trust the results that you get. So they look at all these things in detail, so do go and have a look at it. What we need to do is try and increase the value of research and reduce the harm from research. And actually it was beautifully summed up in 1994 in an editorial in the BMJ by Professor Doug Altman, who some of you will know, very well-known medical statistician. He's the kind of father of all kinds of reporting initiatives and improvements in statistical reporting. He's also the chief statistician at the BMJ. But he wrote this editorial called The Scandal of Poor Medical Research in 1994 with the subtitle, "We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons." And you all may think, oh, great, less research, thanks, we're trying to do more research. Yeah, but it's got to be better. The trouble is all the incentives lead us to do research for the sake of it and to get on in our careers and to score the points that our institutions need to get funding and all of those things, which in themselves seem good idea and are in many ways positive incentives, but they do encourage the generation of a lot of pretty pointless research. And I spend a lot of my time out meeting authors, teaching, listening, and I often hear, well, I didn't really know what to do for my dissertation, but actually it was okay because I got to the department and they said, well, there's this thing someone started a couple of years ago and it kind of fizzled out, so perhaps you can do that. Ooh, that's not a good reason. That's not a good way to pick up a research question. You have to do a lot of work to develop good research questions and to make sure that you're going to answer them with the best possible methods in your setting. Anyway, somebody asked earlier about whether all this kind of thing makes any difference, and this was a nice study published in Trials in 2010, a review. It was done systematically but then interpreted narratively, looking at 40 clinical indications comprising around 50 interventions, and they were across the range, so it was drugs, surgical procedures and devices, and so on, including preventive interventions such as vaccines. And they looked at the different kinds of reporting bias. And sure, there was industry doing a bad job, and we know they were the big bad guys a few years ago, but they have, to quite a big extent, got their act together, not least because of lawsuits and fines and terrible public relations and all of that. But also because they have systems in place, they have money and people to do these things properly, and as Sheila said earlier, industry tends to be very tightly regulated. So those bad old days perhaps are mostly behind us in industry, we will see. But there was also, regulatory agencies such as the FDA were also doing a really bad job of being transparent, and were often allowing people to kind of actively hide data. But this looked at these 40 indications and worked through them, and not surprisingly showed that on the whole these biases at various stages of the research output, if you like, tend to overestimate efficacy and underestimate the risks generally, but it's not always the case. So here's another study which we published in 2012 looking at drugs approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the US quite a long time ago now, 2001 to 2, but in a way that's important because those are those drugs in current use. And they got approved because of trials that were done in the 1990s, and they're the ones that all trials are still trying to get at, because they're the ones that are still very often hidden. Anyway, so they looked at what was published, but they also looked at unpublished FDA reviews, and found that actually sometimes when you did it again and you added the missing data, sometimes you actually found that drugs were more effective, had greater efficacy than expected. It's not always we're going to hide this thing because we don't like it and it makes our product look bad. Sometimes it's just because it just wasn't very well done, it just wasn't very transparent, nobody was interested in the third or fourth paper, they only were interested in the big blockbuster paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. All sorts of reasons why stuff doesn't get out there. But actually sometimes you're hiding benefit, not just harm. So we've seen, again, a figure a bit like this in one of the presentations in the last session, but I just want to make it really clear that although today we're talking quite a lot about results and we're talking about data sets, It's the whole thing. It's the whole thing from the beginning, where we all need to do a better job, particularly when we're looking at trials. And we care so much about trials because in trials, you take people and you do things to them for the purposes of a study. You don't tend to do that in other kinds of study. And sort of better or worse, you say to them, we don't know which one's better. You're going to get put in this group or that group. We won't know which group. You know, you're going to take a punt on that. That's quite a big thing to ask people. And you might be depriving them of what proves to be an incredibly effective intervention because they're in another group, or you might be exposing them to some harms because of the group they're in. That's, you know, we all know that's a huge responsibility. And because of that, that's why we are so worried about making sure that trials are as transparent as possible at all stages. So I would urge all of you to try and look at all of this. Yes, you know that you have to register trials. At least I hope you do. My colleague Elizabeth Loader, who now has the job I used to have at BMJ as the head of the research team, chairing the weekly manuscript and running the peer review process and so on, she was recently shocked, and she's a professor at Harvard, part-time at the BMJ, and one of her research fellows was working on a trial, and she said, so obviously you've registered it, and the fellow said, registered it? What does that mean? You know, she'd never heard of trial registration. And we are amazed how often we get good papers from good centres where a trial wasn't registered prospectively. And, you know, often they just don't seem to know about it. It's kind of weird. So I hope you all do. And it's really important for both scientific and ethical reasons to register trials prospectively. And you will find it tough to get published in a good journal. You can get trials registered by registering them the day before you submit them to a journal. You can register it, you can get your registry ID, you can put it in the paper, and you can cross your fingers and hope the editors won't check, that they won't go and look at the registry, and to be honest, most don't. Most of the millions of journals in the world, you know, if it says it's registered, they'll believe you, they will not check. We check, a lot of the journals do check, and we check the dates and all that, but a lot don't. But that's no excuse. You've got to do it up front. I would urge you to publish your protocols, in fact, for any study. And you can do that in lots of journals these days. For trials, you can do it in the BMC journal Trials. For any study in health, you can do it in BMJ Open, the journal I'm editor-in-chief of. It's a great way to get a publication early in your career, early in your project. It's likely to be cited. It's likely to get people really interested in the work that you're doing. It's a wonderful kind of publication. I would really urge you to publish your protocols as journal articles. We've heard too about summaries of results being available at trial registries, and that is coming more and more the norm and a requirement. And this is terribly important. And when you remember the all trials slogan, it's all trials registered and all results reported. That doesn't mean all trials published. It just means they're out there somewhere where people can find them. And the best place is the trial registry. Then you've got publication, and then you've got the data set. And you may have noticed that all trials is a bit agnostic about data sharing, because Ben would tell you, and he might tell you later if he can squeeze it into his talk, and if he gets here, he's not here yet, he's always flying by the seat of his pants. Oh, maybe he's here now. Oh, you are there. You're here. Okay, good. He made it. Well, great. I'll insult you some more over lunch. That's fine. But he will often say, actually, it's all a distraction, this data sharing stuff. It allows companies to spend a fortune and look good and get their data out there, but they're still not giving us the results of the studies that really matter about the drugs in current use. And it allows them to just forget about that and move on to this big, whizzy, technical thing called data sharing. So all of this matters. And if you get it right from the beginning, it's sort of easier as you go along. Sheila talked about the negative trials. This is the paper people cite most often. It's still the best out there, but there have been lots of others since. This was a very thorough review done way back in 2009. But importantly, it looked at the bias, the publication bias at all stages. So it looked at studies which looked at studies from the beginning. So things like studies that were approved by an ethics committee in Denmark, you know, the National Ethics Review Board or whatever. You know, there were these studies, they were approved. What happened to them? Oh, blimey, you know, this proportion, You never saw them again. You don't know what happened to them. And then the same when you look at trials submitted to the regulatory authority. They were there 1 minute and then they were gone. Never heard what happened to them, and so on. And actually, all of this suggests that the biggest contributor to publication bias is way before publication. And I was told on my first day at the BMJ in May 1989, which is a really long time ago, when you appraise a paper, you look at the question and the methods. We don't care about the results, at least not much, because they don't mean a thing unless the question and the method are okay. And you appraise papers and you decide whether to send them out for peer review on the basis of the question and the methods, not the results. That, I was told that day one, and many good editors are taught that way, and hopefully many peer reviewers. Sure, there is still some bias, but there are plenty of studies showing that the big journals do regularly publish so-called negative studies, and I'm happy to explain what I mean by so-called negative if anyone wants to know. A little bit about all trials. Actually, this needs updating now because I checked just this morning. There are now more than 90,000 individuals signed up to the campaign, and more than 700 organisations, well over now, have joined the campaign. But there again is the ask. It's really simple, which I think is one reason why all trials has really captured people's attention, because it's so straightforward. How could you not agree with that? So then we have this problem. If you think of that Lancet series, we're getting to the last 2 articles now around actual publication. And way back, 1987, here's this study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, looking at trials published in the top journals then. So it was the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, the BMJ, not JAMA or Annals of Internal Medicine, actually. It was just those journals. And there were lots of problems with the reporting of trials. And overall, appeared a bias towards exaggerating treatment differences. You think, oh, well, that was then, but as Ben will tell you, no, this is now. This is pretty damn recent. This is last year, and this was an extremely practical, down-to-earth initiative saying, all right, we're going to look at clinical trials published in New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, the Lancet, Annals of Internal Medicine, and the BMJ, and we're going to compare what ended up in the paper with what was registered and what was in the protocol if we can find it. And there were a ton of discrepancies. And I'll let Ben tell you more about this. And worse, when this group, Ben and his colleagues, contacted the journals and said, there's a discrepancy here, a lot of the journals said, what? And didn't respond, didn't care. I'm sure he might tell you more. What we're interested in when we talk about data sharing is not, more work for you to do just because it's the thing to do, and it's it's not just around the principles of open science, if you like, for the sake of it. It's for a reason. And if you think about that standing on the shoulders of giants thing, which Richard mentioned this morning, the paradigm in science has tended to be that you take what's known and you build on it, or you confirm it, or you refute it, or you extend it. It's an iterative process, scientific discovery and the generation of evidence. And in basic science, until quite recently, this was the paradigm, replication. It was quite normal for lab studies to be published, and then they kind of weren't true until they'd been tried again in the same lab and in lots of other labs, different groups and so on, and then you kind of knew something was true because it replicated. They don't do that anymore in science because the same incentives say, I'm in a hurry, I just want to get my paper in Science or Nature, and I haven't got time to hang around for replications. And that's now going, and it's led to a massive crisis in a lot of science and in other fields such as psychology, where people have realized that no one's trying to do replications, but equally, meanwhile, nobody's working on reproducibility. And so when someone does eventually try to replicate, they go, hang on, actually this wasn't great. And a lot of basic science is beginning to wake up to the fact that actually it's not okay to take 20 rats and say, well, they're all from the same clone, so they're the same. I mean, twins, God, they're not the same, are they? You know that. If you were at school with twins or you have them in your family, they may be identical, but they're not identical. And there are studies now showing that, rats who are supposedly the same genetically, they're very different depending on what they ate and what bedding they slept on and all kinds of things. And of course, mutations that happen during life. So you should randomly select your cells or your rats or your whatever else you're working on in the lab. If you're doing comparative studies, you should randomize and have, you should have control groups, and you should use randomization, and you should use statistical techniques, your methods and results. It's not okay just to say this is what we did and it was true. Bye. We've got our paper in our massively popular journal with a huge impact factor, so we're okay. So that's all very well in theory in basic science, even though it's not much happening anymore. It's not very practical in most epidemiological, public health or clinical research, because we do studies with people, and particularly in trials, it's pretty tough to completely replicate a trial because there won't be equipoise. You won't get ethics approval or funding, and rightly so, really. So in clinical studies and epidemiology, we have to rely on reproducibility rather than replication. And that's, an attainable minimum standard. And this is the argument from this paper by Peng and others in 2006. But they were saying, of course, that one of the things you need, therefore, is the actual raw data set. Now, again, that might be okay if it's a lab study. It might be okay in some observational studies. In a trial, you might have 1 million data points. We're talking a lot of data. We're talking about a lot of stuff. It's not easy. You talk to people in the MRC trials networks in the UK who are doing a lot of this, not least because IPD meta-analysts request the data sets. And it's a lot of work. It takes quite a lot of money and time to get a data set in a shareable state. But this is what we need to be attaining. But it isn't just about data. So this great paper by John Ioannidis and others published last year argued that real reproducibility is as much about the methods and the inferences. It's not just about the results and the data set. So when you think about clinical trial transparency, you really are thinking about the whole thing. A trial is not that one paper, 3,000 words in a top journal, although that's often what the world thinks it is. A trial is the whole thing. It's the registration, the protocol, maybe baseline data studies that you publish, the main outcome, the main primary paper, and then lots of subsequent papers. That's the trial, plus increasingly the actual underlying data set. But really important that we know how you did things. And just having a data set in a repository is not very useful if you don't know enough about how that data set was generated or why. You don't have the story around it. So let's not get completely distracted by the idea that data sharing is going to save us, because it's got to be done with all these other things. Otherwise, it's not much use. I'll do that. I'll skip over that one. But people have been arguing about this stuff for a long time. This was in trials in 2006, quite rightly called "Whose data set is it anyway?" And it was beginning that sort of debate around, well, whose data are they? And still, you talk to researchers who go, well, they're mine. They're my data. And I'm not going to give them to you. Well, are they your data? Because who paid for the work, who trained you, who supported you, who worked with you, who were the people in the trial? They weren't you and your mates. They were patients in clinical settings. All of that. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to scupper your career by publishing one paper and then releasing the data set, and other people scoop it and get further papers out of it before you have a chance. It is possible to share a data set with an embargo. You can agree to a period of fair use where you say, actually, our team plan to do 3 more studies using this data set, and when we've done that, that's when we're going to release the data set. There are things that you can do. You don't own it, but you're the guardians, or the it's a bit like you don't own your kids. You're just looking after them for, I was going to say 18 years, but actually it's a lot longer than that. And it takes them quite a while for them to get off the payroll as well, I say, wistfully. Okay, so you've heard about some of these things. I won't spend long on this, but the European Medicines Agency are providing access right now, not to full data sets, but to clinical study reports, which are 1,000-word documents, but really detailed. And many people working on clinical trial transparency actually say clinical study reports are more useful than raw data sets because they've got the story, they've got the patient details, they're actually much richer than just a bunch of numbers and results. So there's a lot of debate still going on how to do this well. There are all these various initiatives, but you've heard about some of these earlier today. what we're trying to do is change the culture. And the Institute of Medicine in the US came out with actually a really good report on clinical trial data sharing, which is well worth a read. And the appendices are great on the details of how you might do this. But quite rightly, they said we've got to change the culture. So anyway, all this stuff going on with data sharing meant that GSK, as you have heard, and others said, all right, we'll do it. And in fact, some of us went, we weren't really ready. We wanted you to start thinking about it and working out how to do it. But, oh, God, you've gone and done it. And in some ways, there's the argument that actually this is data dumping, not sharing. Because what you've got is these platforms with these data sets, but without much context, without much metadata sometimes, and actually with not that much use. This is the only study so far I've seen. It was a letter in JAMA looking at the usage of data sets from trials, more than 3,000 trials, in several platforms. So it was the industry platform which you saw, which GSK started, and the platforms from Yale and Duke University. And there were more than 3,000 trials, and so far there have been requests asking for 15% of those trials, data from 15%. And of the analyses that had actually been done by the time this letter was published, there were only five that were done to validate the study endpoint, because a lot of companies and others said the New York Times will commission journalists to try and trip us up and to show that we've done bad things and try and get us back in court, and that's why we don't want to do data sharing, because they'll just be trying to rerun our results and prove us wrong. Well, actually, no, people aren't doing that. There's not much of that going on. People are asking other questions, actually. They're using the data sets to ask other questions, sometimes, interestingly, methodological questions rather than clinical questions about the results. So there's something happening, but are we sure it's really data sharing, or are we in danger of getting into dumping? I won't spend long on this, but we at the BMJ thought, well, we can't hang around waiting for everyone to sort this stuff out and decide what's the best standard and the best technical method and this, that, and the other. Why don't we just ask people to do this and see how it goes? So we kind of leapt in 2013 and said, if you're sending us the main paper from a drug trial or a medical devices trial, then we expect you to commit to sharing on reasonable request. And we didn't define reasonable request, because how can you? What we said was, you publish that with us. If someone requests the data set and you say no, then we expect them to come and complain in our correspondence column, our rapid responses, and we expect you to come and defend it and to have an open debate about why you said no. And everyone said, yeah, okay, we'll commit to that. And we didn't hear anything else. And we didn't get any of those people complaining, saying, hey, I tried to get the data set and they said no. But these guys did this study, which they published in BMJ, and which Richard mentioned earlier. And it is in some ways useful, but it is a bit artifactual, because they looked at papers over several years, and we have since 2009 had a mandatory data sharing statement on every research paper, not just trials. And it says, what are you going to do about data sharing? And often it says nothing, but at least it's a clear statement. So they looked at that whole lot of studies, not just the trials, and they looked back before we mandated it for trials. So the sample was not only about trials, and there was an artifact, because they said, okay, you haven't yet shared the data set, why don't you share it with us? And a lot of people said, well, because you're doing a survey, and I'm not going to spend a week and a lot of money sweating away getting my data set into sharing mode just so you can tick a box in your survey. That's not a proper request. So it was a start, but it's not entirely informative. And in fact, some of us, including the Yale group, have just presented a study at the Peer Review Congress in Chicago last month, which was specifically about trialists who have published in the BMJ, PLOS Medicine, and Annals of Internal Medicine under these sort of data sharing mandates. And the study is much more encouraging, actually, and it's going to be published soon. So actually people are sharing. I mean, to be fair, it takes time. You do a trial and you might not get a request from an IPD meta-analyst for some time. So just because people say they're going to share and then when you check they haven't shared yet, it might be because no one's asked. And sure, they haven't gone and put it in a third-party repository, but they may be entirely willing to share it when somebody asks and has a decent study proposal. So it isn't necessarily that they're not planning to share. Okay, there's this thing called the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and they come up with all kinds of things. They came up with the Vancouver style of references way back 25 years ago. They came up with the only criteria we have on who can be an author on a paper in biomedical research. They came up with the uniform requirements for biomedical manuscripts, which is you often see referred to in the instructions for authors for journals. But they tried, I say they, it was we, tried to come up with a clinical trial data sharing policy, which would apply only to the journals on the committee, not all the journals in the world. And it was pretty tough. It was all of this. Basically, if you wanted to publish the main outputs of a clinical trial in one of those journals, you had to share the relevant data set within 6 months. Not the whole data set for your whole project, the data set that was underlying that paper. So not necessarily the whole thing, but the data set for that paper, the full data set. So we published this, and I say we because normally the editors-in-chief go to this committee, but Fiona Godley, the editor of the BMJ, couldn't go. I went for her, so I was one of the authors of this policy. We thought, great. And then we put it out for public consultation, which was an interesting experience. And there was a huge amount of pushback from, just disappointingly, the very large groups of academic trialists who said, no, there are data. No, we don't want to do this. No, you can't make us do this. And very interesting reading. Several people said this is going to be really tough on people in low-income countries because if they are doing trials, which are very tough to do in those settings, they're not going to have the resources to get lots of papers out of their studies. They'll publish one paper and then some, swine sitting in a cushy office in Oxford will do some other lovely secondary analysis and publish it, and they'll get scooped. There's been one example of that I'm aware of, one example. Meanwhile, actually, low-income countries have been doing data sharing from clinical trials and other studies for years, extremely effectively and well, across, for instance, malaria research platforms, Gates Foundation, mother and child research platforms, all kinds of it's going on, it's happening. And actually, on the whole, people in those countries are not fazed about this at all, because they're already doing it, because they tend to have a different culture, a much more collaborative culture. Anyway, this was what the committee finally came up with this year, and it's a start. It's basically saying that if you want to submit a clinical trial paper to any of these journals, then it must include a data sharing statement. And as from, not for a while, 1st of January 2019, so there's a big old wash-in period, you must have registered a data sharing plan at the time of prospective trial registration. It doesn't say what has to be in the plan. It makes some suggestions, which is on my next slide. But then when you send in your paper, you have to say how you've complied with that registered plan and if you've deviated it from in some way, and we would expect you to follow it. Those journals the core journals on this committee are the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, the BMJ, Annals of Internal Medicine, JAMA, and other journals from around the world who join the committee for a few years at a time. No other journals would have to follow this policy. It's just those ones. But I go and talk to authors in a small hospital in India, and they say, I write every paper as if I'm going to get it into the New England Journal of Medicine. And in fact, I usually send them there, but they reject them. But that's my aim, and that's where I start. So this committee has enormous influence because it includes those big journals. So even though actually the policies don't apply to anybody else, people feel they've got to follow them, which I suppose can be a good thing. So this is what has to go into a data sharing statement in terms of the fields, if you like. But you can see there's a lot of wriggle room here. The committee is not mandating what goes in here. It's just whether de-identified individual participant data will be shared, what data will be shared, what documents will be available as well, such as the protocol and the statistical analysis plan, and so on. What data, when the data will become available. So that leaves room for the authors to say, well, yeah, they won't be available for 2 years after we finish the study because we want a period of fair use. So there's lots of flexibility in it, but I guess it's a start. However, a lot of people were very disappointed. I don't know if some of you know about statnews.com, which is a really interesting, good website based in the US. It's a great source of news and new papers and so on. It's effectively a kind of online newspaper, I suppose, but it's very good. Anyway, they said that this data sharing policy from ICMJE was massively backtracking on the proposed policy, and it's a couple of weak sticks and no carrots. And since patients are taking the risks here, maybe they should start boycotting all trials whose investigators refuse to share their data. So, quick look at carrots and sticks. Am I doing all right for time? Yeah, okay. John Ioannidis, again, who some of you will know, is the sort of maverick based at Stanford. In fact, if you've ever seen him, he nearly always wears a white suit, and he has this droopy 70s moustache. He's extraordinary, actually. He's kind of a sort of rock star of epidemiology. Intriguing guy. Very, very, very quiet and very, very disruptive. Interesting mixture. Anyway, there you go. And he's always saying, everything we know is wrong and that kind of thing. Usually backed up with a lot of evidence. But he suggested this way of shifting the academic incentives and reward system away from all the awful things like impact factor, which is a lousy metric. Because he was trying to attract clinicians' attention, he called it this PQRST Index, which is like an ECG curve, PQRST. So I'll just let you read that. So, are we doing research that is productive, high quality, reproducible, shareable, and translatable? We ought to be. We ought to be. That was a long article. Sorry, the reference seems to have fallen off the end, but you'd find it. I can't remember where he published it now. Sorry, I did have the reference. Some of us, well, he and the group at Stanford, the Metrics Meta Research Institute that he is involved in at Stanford, has convened an international group. And in fact, there's another one that's been convened by the Wellcome Trust, the Royal Society, several UK universities, BMJ, PLOS, Hindawi, and eLife. But anyway, there's two groups now trying to look at ways to incorporate open science principles and reproducibility, translatability, research quality into the incentive system, and to get away from these things like impact factor. The UK group I just mentioned is doing a great job. We managed to nobble the G7 science ministers earlier this year, and their recent statement on science includes a section on this very thing, on the fact that academia should reward researchers for these sorts of practices, not just for the journal impact factor where they publish. And we're looking at all sorts of ways to get people on board. But there is already an existing way called DORA, which is the Declaration of Research Assessment, Declaration on Research Assessment, the San Francisco Declaration. And it's a one-pager which says, I solemnly swear that as an institution or an individual, I'm not going to take too much notice of things like impact factor, and I'm actually going to look at these things, which are true measures of research quality and usefulness in my institution. And if you don't know about DORA, Google it, San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, and go and sign up. And then live by it, of course. You can't just sign it. And many institutions worldwide are doing this, and let's hope it takes off. Right, nearly there. So journals can do a bit. You heard from Richard how peer reviewers can help to nudge people in the direction of saying, yeah, well, it looks like a nice paper, but how open is it? How useful is it? How transparent is it? Journals can do a certain amount with policies, and that policy from ICMJE, I'm sure, will change things, because if the New England Journal of Medicine wants you to have a data sharing plan, then you're going to have a data sharing plan, because that's sort of how it works. But journals can do other things, and journals can do what many other fields have already done, particularly in basic science and information technology and other fields. They can hook up with open repositories to help people share data if they've got data which is shareable actually on the open free web, such as Figshare and Dryad. And at BMJ Open, we've been integrated with Dryad from the very beginning. And we do have a lot of data sets. So you publish your paper, 5 minutes, thanks. You publish your paper and you put the full data set in Dryad. And the two are linked to each other by DOI, Digital Object Identifier. And we have got a few clinical trial data sets in there, de-identified. So there are things you can do which are terribly easy. And Dryad, again, was terribly practical and kind of quick and dirty, and said, well, look, this is an ideal way to share your data, but frankly, we'll take anything. You know, if all you've got is Excel spreadsheets, that might be better than nothing, although some people will argue it might be worse than nothing. Anyway, there are things that journals are doing. But importantly, I just want to finish back where we all started with patients. And I mentioned this morning in the discussion that we're trying to really get this going at the BMJ in various ways, including through patient review as part of the review process, peer review process. But when we started asking authors to put in their papers in the methods section, how have you involved patients and the public in your study, quite a few people put, well, there were patients in the study. No, that's not what we meant, actually. It's like in the old days when we started requiring protocols for every trial that we published. We wanted to see the protocol that was used, the version that was used, so that we and the peer reviewers could look at it, because it's often much more informative than the paper. And when we started asking for this, we got a lot of emails back saying, oh, what would you like us to put in the protocol? It's the same problem I have when I go out and talk with particularly younger researchers and about writing papers. They say, yeah, but I'm trying to write my paper and I don't really know how to do the literature review. And I say, didn't you do it at the beginning when you were developing your research question? Because that's when you can, that's really when you need to do it. You can update it when you're writing your paper, but it's a bit late now. Anyway, there you go. But patients. NEJM, New England Journal of Medicine, did publish that research parasite thing, but they did publish a lot of other views on data sharing over the past year. And this was a good piece on patient perspectives about clinical trial data sharing. And these two quotes, I think, are pretty salutary. However, what we hugely lack is information on what trial participants think about sharing of de-identified individual patient data. It's a huge gap in the evidence base. If any of you are looking for projects, please go and generate some information on that. We know a bit about it for biobanks. We know a bit about it for disease registries. We know very little about people's views on data sharing in clinical trials, and we could really do with it, because trialists tend to think, oh, the patients would hate it, they'll all freak out and feel that their privacy is being invaded. Well, yeah, really? We haven't asked them. And anecdotally, patients say quite the opposite, like the patient you heard in the All Trials video this morning. Actually, an awful lot of patients say, sorry, what do you mean? You did a trial, you spent, hundreds of thousands of euros on it. You got us to take part. We thought we were doing this to help other people, and you haven't. You haven't made all your methods and results and data available. How dare you? But that's only anecdotes. So please, 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 if you're at a loose end, go and generate some real research data on what patients think and want, because this is crucial. So thank you very much. It's nearly lunchtime. It is lunchtime. You must all be starving. So I'm happy to take questions over lunch if you're all about to faint, but otherwise I could take a couple now.